section of the class. We're going to come back to it later in a bit more detail. But what we are interested in is understanding dyslexia, both acquired dyslexia and developmental dyslexia, from the framework of a theory. And of course, the theory is a diagram like this, which is referred to as a functional architecture. And I'm going to walk you through the idea. It's actually not, it looks scary, but it isn't at all. It just says, it's a claim, and it turns out there's lots of evidence in favor of this claim. We're going to talk about later, not for Friday, but later on in the semester, how to elaborate this a little bit more. But what this says is quite straightforwardly, when you read a word, we're just talking about single word reading, you identify the letters as very rapidly, and you look up the spelled form of the word, the sequence of letters making up words in your vocabulary inside this component called the orthographic lexicon. Now, relative to the Wernicke-Lichtheim diagram, you will recall A is a component, a center, that stores the sound of words in your vocabulary. This is the exact equivalent, but in written form. So if I give you a word like tortoise, it's in your vocabulary. It's stored there as Tortoise. You have tens of thousands of, as a skilled reader, you have tens of thousands of words stored here. And this is the phonological lexicon, which is the pronunciation of the word, not the written form, but the spoken form. And then there's another set of systems which is sort of not represented in any detail here, how to actually articulate the word, so that when I show you Tortise, you access the letters in sequence very quickly. You access the word as a written sequence, Tortoise. You look up the pronunciation, and then you produce the word. Notice, I put this in black to help you. This claim is that in order to do this, you don't have to access the meaning. You do, naturally, as part of our understanding. But if I damaged meaning, and when would I damage meaning? In semantic dementia. This root, all other things being equal, is still intact. So this root is called the direct root, and you should be thinking, so there's method in our madness, as people are nodding, wow, there was also a direct root in the Wernicke-Lichtheim diagram. So notice how we've built sneakily on the past here, right? It's the same idea. So notice that in the direct root in the Wernicke-Lichtheim diagram, you go from A to M without meaning. Here you go from a little bit more complicated, but from letters to words, to the written words, the visual form of words, in other words, the spoken form of words out directly. Now, unlike the Wernicke-Lichtheim diagram, there's a separate mechanism that is called grapheme to phoneme conversion rules. And it's a claim, and there's a very remarkable result that shows it's on the right track, and I'll talk about that. That this takes, look at this, it takes the letters and it converts the letters into a pronunciation using rules. So this is called the non-lexical root, meaning it does not rely on looking up stored words, but rather the pronunciation of subword units, and the subwords are graphemes, little combinations like IN or NT, and how you pronounce them. So this is for reading words you've never seen before, right? And that's how, by some complex process that's of great interest, but it's not the topic of this tutorial, you learn to read. So when you're a beginning reader, you sound out painfully the subword units using this root from letters to grapheme phoning rules to speech output, and gradually you develop a sight vocabulary. But a beginning reader doesn't look at tortoise and say, oh, that says tortoise. You go laboriously, and I notice I've chosen tortoise for a sneaky reason. So just to show you, okay, and by the way, the written assignment includes a slightly more complex version of this, which I'll talk about, but it should pose no trouble. This is, if you look here, this actually is just a crappy version, not a very nice artistic version of what I've just shown you. And then on the left is the same idea for auditory words. So that if I say, can you, do you understand tortoise? That's this component, this sort of section here. And this one is T-O-R-T-O-I-S-E, right? Please, question.
I was just going to say, when you hear it auditorily, does it do the same thing as in, like, you hear it auditorily and then you find the letters? And then
Well, you know, because, good point. This is pure language, auditory language. This is pure written language. So look at this. It says you analyze the sound sequence, tortoise. You access the word as a spoken form in your lexicon. That's the equivalent of Wernicke's idea, right? You look up the meaning, or there's a direct route from A to M, right? That's this route. And then you produce the words. So this is just, in some sense, the Wernicke-Lichtheim model, right? There's a slight variation here, is that here you can access the word as a spoken form, and there's another link that Wernicke didn't include in the diagram. You can analyze tortoise as a sequence of sounds, and then reproduce this, but without thinking about what the word means. So if I said, say, bachyform, you just say bachyform, you know, and you're not looking up the word, you go from the input to the output. But that's of little interest to us right now. We are focusing on reading, so don't be too intimidated by this. It's just for heard words, you go through here, but we are interested in written words for now, right? Okay. So here are the different components. There's letters, identify the letters. The stored visual form of a word in your sight vocabulary, and you have thousands and thousands of those. The stored pronunciation, and then rules for assembling a pronunciation when the word is not familiar, right? Or a nonsensical word. Okay. Now, what are the rules? I'm going to give you an easy way to understand this. Imagine I show you V-O-O-K, VOOK. So there's nothing like that here in the orthographic lexicon. Book exists, but not VOOK. And the way to understand how these rules work is, what is the most common pronunciation of O-O-K as a sequence? It's not a word, but it's a familiar subword unit. Well, it's ook, as in look, book, took, nook, rook, snook. And if I give you V, O-O-K, the rule is, well, take O-O-K, it's typically pronounced ook. Take V, it's pronounced the. Put them together, and the result is book. And this is how this rule works. Did you see that? Everyone understand? So far, so good? So the subword spelling to sound unit, the grapheme to phoneme conversion rules, work by taking sequences of letters, assigning them a pronunciation, and then assembling the pronunciation to produce a word. Okay? So, or not a word, a pronunciation, because it can be vuk, which is not a word, right? But now something interesting happens. Can you see that the rules, O-O-K, ook, using this non-lexical root, will produce the correct pronunciation, not just for vuk, but book. So technically, if you damage this root, you can read book via this rule-based system, and you'll get the right answer. The patient will say, that says book. That clear? But look at leopard. Sorry. So leopard, according to the rules, ARD is ard, as in hard, yard, etc. EO is EO. So using the rules, this says leopard. Can everyone see that? And that is known as an exception word, an orthographically irregular word, and there's tons of those in English. And that gives beginning readers a nightmarish experience, because you have rules, and then you get the correct pronunciation, and there's the word that pops up, and it violates the rules. You have to recognize the whole word. Hand, if you use the rules, it's correct. Hand and band and rand and stand. So using the rules, without looking up the word here, but just using the rule, you would say hand. But look at P-I-N-T. You have lint, mint, stint, flint, and now pint. So pint is an orthographic exception word. It should have been pint using the rules. Can everyone see that? If it's like mint and yint, lint and flint, and etc., stint, you should say pint. But the correct pronunciation is pint, and according to the rules, if you're relying on this system, you will say pint. Can everyone see that? All right. So leopard, using rules, would be pronounced leopard, and pint, using the rules, by analogy, mint, stint, lint, flint, glint, should be pint. Okay, so we're going to talk about syndromes now, reading disorders that rely on this dissociation between the non-lexical root and the direct lexical root, and then more complexly the relationship between this direct root and meaning. We'll come to that. What you should see here is that we are borrowing from the Wernicke-Lichtheim diagram and extending it by making additional assumptions. So if I asked you what in this diagram is the analog in the written form with respect to Wernicke's diagram, A would be the orthographic lexicon because it's an input mechanism. M would be the phonological lexicon because it's the output, it's the pronunciation, right? And there's the ideation, or B, that's the semantic system. Okay? This is a very similar idea. What is different is this root. Unlike Wernicke, where there's no root for that, is in the written form, in the written modality, there's a special root that you have to learn or develop in order to become a reader. You have to start there. You have to use the rules. You have to figure out how to say int is it. Okay, as a beginner. So far, so good? Any questions? We're good. So imagine two tasks. So now we're going to talk about dissociation methodology. Task one is reading nonsense words. So they have no representation in the orthographic lexicon. You've never seen them before. But you can retrieve the pronunciation using this root. You can read int as int, y is ya, and yint is yint. G-O-O-P is, I think a word, goop is a word, but pretend it isn't, right? Sife, wife, life, rife, sife, etc. All of these words, nonsense words, can be pronounced using grapheme to phoneme conversion if that root's intact. Task two would be reading orthographic exception words, which means that you must use this root in order to read them correctly. So look, P-I-N-T is pint, not pint. A-C-H-E is ache, not atch. This one is really interesting because B-E-A-D is bead, but E-A-D is typically ed, as in head, bread, instead, dread. I hope you're not in a state of dread right now, right? So this is an exception word. B-O-T-H is both, but the regular pronunciation is moth, as in moth, both, sloth, right? So O-T-H is off, but you say oath, both, etc. So in order So imagine I find a patient and they read all of these words very well in task 2, and they are seriously impaired in task 1. That exists very clearly. I've seen that many times. And it's called phonological dyslexia. Phonological dyslexia means the non-lexical root is seriously damaged, but this root from letters to words in the lexicons is preserved, is intact. That's phonological dyslexia. Okay? Very straight. That's sort of rather easy to understand. Now imagine instead this component is damaged. The orthographic lexicon has not lost all the entries that you've laboriously stored in your lifetime as a skilled reader, but a large subset. And again, I look at how you read these nonsense words and orthographic exception words. This route will allow you to read the nonsense words correctly, but you cannot find the word for pint, ache, and so on in your orthographic lexicon, and so instead you'll use this route to read them aloud. And what you will produce then is what is known as regularization errors. You will read pint as pit, ache as atch, you'll say that's not a word, bead as bed, and both as both. So you get a lot of these wrong, and your understanding of what the word means is based on your pronunciation. So the patient, if they are impaired here, will say, pint, I don't know what that means. Atcha, it's not a word. That says bed. You fall asleep on it. They will say that. Both, not a word. You see that? That is known as, so impaired on task 2, but preserved on task 1. That is called surface dyslexia. So you have phonological dyslexia, damage to the non-lexical root, surface dyslexia, damage to the lexical root. So far, so good? And if you ask, well, what if you have phonological dyslexia, what will the patient say if this root is damaged, the grapheme to phoneme conversion root, what will the patient say if you give them a nonsense word? The answer is typically they will say, I don't know what that says, I can't read it. Or they'll take a wild guess and produce a word. So they might read Y-I-N-T as, I don't know, rift, some wild guess. Right? At the back, yes.
Would we see similar results on task 1 and task 2 if the person had, let's say, a lesion in the phonological lexicon?
That's a really interesting question. Hold that. Okay. I will address that later. It's a really interesting question. Okay, so far so good. So here is a case of MP, and she has surface dyslexia. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So these are words varying in how familiar they are in the language. So 200 plus per million is a very common word. A word like have is very common. 0 to 9 per million is a very infrequent word, like yacht, not very often seen in print. And what you see here is her ability to read words when they conform to English spelling to sound rules, and you can see that she's nearly 100%, not always, but relative to age-matched controls, which I didn't, this is my data, I didn't do it, I should have had age-matched controls, so my mea culpa. But we assume it's very close to normal. But look at the exception words. So these are words that violate the rules of English spelling to sound translation. And what you find is that as the words become less and less common in the language, she will make more and more mistakes. And she regularizes all of them. So if you gave MP Y-A-C-H-T, and you say, read it, she'll say, that says yash. If you gave her mother, which is a bit, H-A-V-E, which is very common, she said, that says ham. Right? But if you have even a word that's not very common at all, but that you can pronounce using the rules, she'll get it right. Not 100%, but pretty close. Okay, that's surface dyslexia. Here's just a little result that's of interest. We can quickly understand it and move on. If you damage this system here, and what you see is surface dyslexia, is this component the same for writing as it is for reading? Is there another lexicon for writing as opposed for reading? So supposing I say, write the word yacht, you still have to look up Y-A-C-H-D, otherwise you'll write it as Y-O-T, and as you know, if you're a beginning reader or writer, when you were 6 years old, that's how you would write yacht, as Y-O-T. But is it the same lexicon for reading and for writing? And you can look at this patient, MP, and ask, if she reads the word correctly, and notice some of these exception words she reads correctly, some she doesn't, right? If she reads it correctly, does she spell it correctly? And if she spells it correctly, does she read it correctly? And if she reads it incorrectly, does she spell it incorrectly? And this is spelling to dictation. So I say, write yacht, and she writes. Well, what does she write? Y-A-C-H-T or Y-O-T? And the answer is that it looks as if there's the same lexicon used for reading and for writing. And how do I know? Well, look at this table. So this is reading. These are common words. These are much less common words. These are sort of intermediately frequent words, not very common, not very uncommon. And plus plus would mean you read correctly, you write correctly. Minus minus means you read incorrectly, you write incorrectly, and then plus minus is you read correctly and you write incorrectly, and vice versa. And you can see here that most of her results are she reads it incorrectly. If she reads it incorrectly, she writes it incorrectly. But interestingly, if she reads it correctly, she writes it correctly, right? So 9 versus 21, and the other diagonal reads incorrectly, writes correctly, writes incorrectly, reads correctly, hardly any on this diagonal. So this diagonal, 9, 21, 11, 23, 5, 7, she's not writing many correctly at all, or reading very correctly down here. But in these two boxes, 20 to 49 per million and 10 to 19 per million, you can see she's not making many mistakes for 50. She's not making many mistakes here. But when she makes mistakes in the middle or low frequency range, so this means she didn't make many mistakes because they're common. But here they're not so common, and here they're very uncommon. She makes a lot of mistakes when she reads. She makes a lot of mistakes when she writes. And if she doesn't make a mistake when she reads, she gets it right, she won't make a mistake when she writes either. So this is evidence that it's the same lexicon for reading and for writing. Does everyone see that? Right? And if the evidence was against that, what you'd see is, well, there's a lot in this diagonal of mistakes where she reads it incorrectly but writes it correctly, or writes it incorrectly and reads it correctly. Not many, right? It's mostly if it reads right, if it reads correctly, you write correctly. And if you read incorrectly, you write incorrectly. So this is a surface dyslexic case that provides support that there's a single lexicon for reading and for spelling. Here's the double dissociation. So this would be a surface dyslexic who's seriously impaired on exception words. The phonological dyslexic is impaired on reading nonsense words, so they read exception words very well, just like a normal. When you read pronounceable nonsense words, however, it's the phonological dyslexic that is seriously impaired. The surface dyslexic is normal. Everyone see that? That's the double dissociation. Be very careful. This definition is a very rigid one. You have to be normal on one task, not less impaired. So this is a clear double dissociation, implying those two roots are really separate. You can damage the non-lexical root, leaving the lexical root intact, and vice versa. And this is the evidence for it. This is not a double dissociation. And the reason is that the phonological dyslexic patient is also impaired on exception words, right? Not as much as the surface dyslexic, but this patient is not normal. So both patients are impaired on exception words. Both patients are impaired on pronounceable words, though to a lesser degree in one case versus another. This is not good evidence for clearly dissociable mechanisms, whereas this is, and this is the result you see. This actually exists. So it means that in terms of this diagram, these roots are indeed separate. You can damage one but not the other, which is very interesting as skilled readers. We can read using rules, or we can read by looking up the pronunciation of a word in your vocabulary. All right. So this gives you a double dissociation. This slide just tells you that that's true. Here's a little complication. So now it's time to sort of think, whoa, okay, right? So everyone understood so far? Sort of straightforward. Here is a result that is not so straightforward, and it goes back to our old topic, semantic dementia. So watch this, it's very interesting, and it holds behind it a great mystery that we were not able to really fully confront when the mystery became apparent. And it is this. Look at this. Can you see this is what is damaged in semantic dementia? The semantic system. Everyone accept that? Now it turns out that when you test patients with semantic dementia, a huge number of them, not all of them, but 40 out of 50 cases will have surface dyslexia. So they will say, I don't understand the meaning of tortoise. If you give the word in spoken form, do you understand tortoise? They'll say no. And you show them tortoise as a written word, and they'll say that says tortoise. So there's an association between semantic impairments in semantic dementia and surface dyslexia. Now notice, this diagram indicates there's no relationship here, right? Look, according to this diagram, I can completely remove the semantic system, and this root will go just fine. These other two roots will work just fine. So what do you make of the fact that a large number of patients with semantic dementia have surface dyslexia? And here's the rub. A small subset don't. You're right, you were anticipating that, right? So here is patients who, a handful, typically 1 in 50 cases. You show them tortoise, T-O-R-T-O-I-S-E. They say that says tortoise. You say, do you know what tortoise means? Haven't the foggiest idea. You show them yacht, Y-A-C-H. They say that's yacht. Do you know what it is? Sorry, can't remember. Right? P-I-N-T, pint. Any idea? Not a clue. That's 1 in 50. So this has resulted in a controversy. There are two ways of dealing with the controversy. Here's one way. All right, when you damage the semantic system in semantic dementia, the damage doesn't stay in the semantic system. It spreads out into the rest of the brain through atrophy. And so, because I damage the semantic system, there's sort of spreading atrophy all through the language system, and some of it engulfs the orthographic lexicon just by chance. And that happens in 49 out of 50 cases. There's a very important term for this in the literature. It is termed a mere quote unquote association, which means there's no theoretically interesting reason behind the fact that in 49 out of 50 cases, there is a relationship between semantic dementia and surface dyslexia. It's just atrophy of the brain. Here's a nut, so that's one, that just means, look, it's uninteresting, just forget about it, it's just atrophy. Here's a more insidious possibility. This diagram is wrong. Not always wrong, it's wrong in a few cases, in 1 out of 50 people. So this diagram is that, in fact, most people in order to use this root correctly, have to rely on the meaning of the word. So look what I've done here. Instead of just going from the orthographic lexicon to the semantic system and then out, it's a little bit like Wernicke's idea that you need A for M to work. So to have the orthographic lexicon function correctly, you must consult the meaning. That's the 49 out of 50 people who read exception words incorrectly when they have semantic dementia. The 1 out of 50 case is an unusual variant of the normal reader. They do not need this red arrow. And so when you damage the semantic system for those readers, they read exception words correctly. Do you see the difference in the theory? The one is of theoretical importance. The atrophy theory says it's just a byproduct of damage to the brain. What do you want from us? Now, this has produced a controversy that has never been fully resolved. And just as a matter of little gossip, it resulted in one very famous neuropsychologist, I'm not mentioning names, but it's Max Coltart, actually no longer speaking to another neuropsychologist. Again, I'm not mentioning names, but it's Carol Patterson. And they don't talk to each other because Max Coltart favored this idea. This idea, atrophy, and Carolyn favored that idea. And they just couldn't work it out between them. So that's how science sometimes works. And I remember asking Tim Shallis, who was my tutor when I was an undergraduate, why don't they talk to each other? And he says, because she was so hurt that he wouldn't. It's on record here, so, well, I'm happily recording. But anyway, fine, just a bit of gossip. And he said because she was so hurt that she could not persuade him of this idea. But so how is it resolved? It has not. Do you understand the issue, though? It's kind of a nice, juicy issue, but it means some of us are born with the ability to construct a reading mechanism without relying on the blue and red arrow. And most of us need the red arrow to read exception words. You need, when I say tortoise, when I read it, I have to know what it means. Otherwise, I'll say tortoise. But for the lucky few, some very skilled readers just say, bam, that's tortoise. I haven't yet computed the meaning. I'm very fast. Who they are, so it would be lovely. I mean, the way to resolve this is to be able to identify the individuals beforehand and say, oh, look, there is lawful variation in the population, which predicts that some people will need both these arrows and some will just need the blue arrow if you ask for me. Is it clear? So that's a little trade secret I'm sharing with you. Okay. This is why the model is so interesting. It applies to developmental dyslexia, as it should. So if you look at developmental dyslexia, you will see, typically, that the children who have developmental dyslexia are not very good at reading exception words and not very good at reading nonsense words. But you can see, if you look carefully enough, some are very, very bad at reading nonsense words and quite good at reading exception words. And then there's reverse. And so you can find those cases, if you look carefully enough, in developmental dyslexia. So here's a case, I think a paper by Castles and Coltart, who examined irregular and non-word readings, task A and task B that I've demonstrated here, 53 boys with dyslexia and 56 age-matched controls, and indeed, 1/3 of the dyslexic children were in the normal range on one of these tasks and seriously below the 5th percentile on the other, the double dissociation in developmental dyslexia. That's really intriguing. So when you have a kid who has trouble reading and going on to become a fluent reader, one possibility is both roots are not developing properly. The other quite likely possibility is one of the roots is more impaired than the other. Which is it? Is it the phonological, the grapheme to phoneme conversion route, or the direct lexical route? Which is it? And the therapy has to be targeted accordingly. All right? Okay. So here, 8 of these children had pure phonological dyslexia, developmentally. And so very bad non-word reading, but irregular word reading within the normal range. That's really remarkable. And 10 children had developmental surface dyslexia. Very bad irregular word reading, like yacht and pint, but pretty good reading of nonsense words. I'm pretty sure one of my children has phonological dyslexia, but we will not go into details. Okay. All right. Okay. And of course, in the majority, they co-occur. You have both roots are not developing fully. Okay. What does it mean if you are developmental dyslexic and you can't learn to read nonsense words? What is missing? And here's one possibility which, in fact, has been disproven. One possibility is, look, in order to read a nonsense word, I have to know how to associate a letter with a sound. So yint, I have to know y is y, in, is in, t is t, and then I have to assemble the whole thing. So I should be able to, if that's true, show that even when I present words acoustically, you can't do it. You still can't do this. So if I say, look, yint, what would it sound like if you remove the ya? You who are skilled readers will say it's it, right? Or if I have 2 words like farmer, and I say what happens if you take out the ER at the end, what's left? You'll say it's farm. Are these the children impaired at that particular level, meaning it's a language, general language problem, a subtle language problem? And the answer is no, it's not that, typically. And the difficulty is, notice, if I ask you, what does bring sound like? I'm just presenting the word acoustically now. If I remove the b, and you say ring, how are you doing it? Are you using sound? Or are you using your knowledge of written words to form an image, B-R-I-N-G? Take out the B and I see in my mind's eye ring, which means, of course, if you're developmentally dyslexic, you'll be impaired on the spoken form of this task because you can't use the written grapheme to phoneme route very well. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg problem, but so it's extremely difficult to determine if you haven't got good phonological awareness. I can't go from B-R-I-N-G and take away the b to say I hear ring now in my head. Is it because you do not have phonological ability, or is it that you can't imagine the written form of the word properly? But in fact, so here's the problem in a nutshell. If you are phonologically dyslexic, maybe you can't visualize the nonsense words. And you therefore impaired even when I present the words in spoken form. But in fact, here's a 13-year-old girl. It's a rare case, but it disproves this idea. And so she was very good at auditory phoneme discrimination, and what I mean by that is, can she tell the difference between ba and pa? And of course, if you can't, then if I give you B-A-P and P-A-P, you can't pronounce them differently because you can't hear the difference in your own head. So there's phoneme discrimination, non-word repetition, so if you can't repeat a nonsense word, you sure as hell can't read it. But she's very good at that. Syllable deletion would be if I give you banana and I take out the ba. What's left? You say nana. She did that very well. And then the phoneme deletion is bring. If I take out the b, what's left? She would say ring. She did all of this very, very well. But she had very impaired non-word reading nonetheless. She was a clear phonological dyslexic, which means that the difficulty lies in the reading system itself. It's not a general language disorder. Is it clear to everyone? Because she does rather well when I give her language-like tasks involving manipulation of sounds. But the minute I go into the reading modality, she can't do that, right? So that means literally if I gave this young lady bring, and I said, how would it sound if you remove the ba? she'll say, if I bring down and said how would it sound without the first letter, she wouldn't be able to do that because she has phonological dyslexia. Okay? What about, and so this implies, of course, that the deficit in developmental phonological dyslexia is in the reading system itself. And then finally, what about young children who are surface dyslexic? Is there some visual disorder that prevents the development of a sight vocabulary? And again, the answer is no. No, it's in the reading mechanism itself. So here's a case by Castles and Coulthard, indicates that this case, LH, is perfectly good in lots and lots of visual, spatial, and visual perceptual skills, and nevertheless has difficulty in reading exception words, right? So according to this, the developmental dyslexia matches quite well what we see in acquired dyslexia, if you look for individual cases. All right. We had a very interesting question at the back, and I'm going to answer this question now. It's a really important question. Surface dyslexia typically is impairment in the orthographic lexicon. But what happens if instead it's the phonological lexicon that's damaged? So notice I still can't use the direct route if the phonological, I think that was your question, right? If I cannot access sound of words, then I can't use the direct route. What would it look like though? So the lexicon, the orthographic lexicon is intact. Grapheme to phoneme conversion rules is intact. But I can't look up the pronunciation in the phonological lexicon. Who can tell me what you think what is that form of surface dyslexia? What would it look like? So I show the patient Tortoise. They look up the word, they access the meaning, right? But they cannot come out and access the pronunciation because the phonological lexicon is damaged. But they've accessed the meaning, and they use now this route to say, that says tortoise. Right? You see that? But what would be the difference between that patient who's damaged at the phonological lexicon and the patient who's damaged in the orthographic lexicon? There's a crucial difference, and what would it be? Yes, please.
Like I think like if they had damaged like the phonological lexicon, like they would know what the word is and like how to spell it, but they just don't know like how to say it.
It's very close, but not quite right. I'll show you what that difference is. If you damage this orthographic lexicon and I show you Tortoise, the patient will say, that says tortoise, and I have no idea it's not a word. Right? I have no idea what it could be. But if you damage the phonological lexicon, the patient is still going to say tortoise because they cannot retrieve the pronunciation either from the direct route or via meaning. You see that? Because to get to here, you can either go directly or via meaning, but neither route is optional because neither pathway is optional because the phonological lexicon is damaged. But if I take the patient and I say, look, you said this word is tortoise. Which one of these animals could it be? The patient will immediately say it's this one. I can't pronounce the word because I don't have access in the phonological lexicon, but I jolly well know what this thing means, and I know what this word means. It says tortoise, but I know what it means. Can you see the difference? Whereas if you damage the orthographic input lexicon and you show tortoise to the patient with the orthographic input lexicon damage, the patient will say it says tortoise. None of those are right. They may figure it out sort of in a algorithmic way. Will say, look, it's tortoise. This is a toad. This is a lobster. This is an iguana. This is tortoise, but it says tortoise, you know. But maybe that's how, you know, you'd get some complicated reasoning if the orthographic input lexicon is damaged. But if it's the phonological output lexicon, then the patient will point correctly. So I hope that answers the question raised at the back. So you can have two forms of surface dyslexia. One is a problem in actually looking up the orthographic form of the word. The other is looking up the pronunciation with an intact orthographic lexicon. And there was a question. Yes, please.
So when the patient uses instead, because the phonological is damaged, so they'll go around the...
They go around the direct route,
So
yes.
they'll say tortoise, and if the interviewer just says, okay, what does that mean? They'll have said, oh, I hear myself saying tortoise. And
That's exactly the way to say it. So that's important. So notice, I didn't sort of indicate all this machinery that's sort of tacked on here, just for simplicity's sake. Sorry, let's go back here. If you have surface dyslexia, you do not rely on this route, and of course you do not rely on the meaning, unless of course the phonological lexicon is damaged. But you can access a pronunciation using grapheme phoneme conversion, and then you hear yourself produce the word. Now if you hear yourself say tortoise, you'll say, that's what that says, it's meaningless. If you hear yourself say B-E-A-D is bed, because the rule says E-A-D, E-A-D is ed, as in dread and spread and so on, you'll say, I know what that says bed. You lie on it, even though it says B, but the rules are getting the patient to hear themselves say bed, right?
And you
they'd
can
say,
identify the picture because only the...
no, they would point to a bed then, right? If the orthographic input lexicon
Oh,
is
no,
there.
if the font...
Oh, if they, then they would say that says bed, but they would point to bead as a picture, because they understand the word, right? But they would still say that says bed, right? In fact, they probably wouldn't say fluently, because if the phonological lexicon is seriously damaged, they're not going to be talking much. So they would say bed, you know. But how are they doing it? They're using this route and hearing themselves say it. But they understand it, right? Okay, that's a very unusual variant of surface dyslexia in the clinic. You're not going to see it in developmental dyslexia, but in the clinic, but it does exist. Yes, at the back.
So just to make sure I got this, phonological, if they had damage in the phonological lexicon on the tortoise task, then if you read the word out loud, they'd be able to point and be like...
Well, if you said to them, point to the tortoise,
Yeah.
they would now be using not this at all. They would be using the auditory system, which there's a diagram of in the reading. They would just, they know what you say. But if you wrote tortoise, T-O-R-T-O-I-S-E, and you say point, they have to use this. They can't look up the pronunciation. They access the meaning, and the pronunciation is generated this way. They say tortoise, but they know what the word, what the actual word means, right? Yeah. And the reason is, if you ask them, look, when you pronounce this picture, how will you pronounce it? They're not going to be able to do it because they can't look up the pronunciation here. So they would say, I don't know. Right? If you write T-O-R-T-O-I-S-E, they would say, well, it says tortoise. But they would know what the word means, and they would know what the picture means. So this is all in retrieving the pronunciation of the word. That's M in Broca's.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Would it be affected by like local pronunciation? So like some words like sloth are like pronounced like
Yes,
regularly,
it
but
would.
then sloth.
It would. It depends on how the conventions of your own language. But there's also a most interesting kind of word that is not an exception word, but what we call in English a homophone. And there are tons of those. So F-A-R-E and F-A-I-R. Fair, the pronunciation is the same. Now you as skilled readers know, well, F-A-R-E refers to bus fare, and F-A-I-R refers to like a country fair, or this is not fair. But according to this diagram, if you damage the orthographic lexicon, both have the same pronunciation, and you'll say, I'm not sure which it means. F-A-R-E could just as well be bus fare. Well, this is unfair, right? And you can see that in little kids, like, you know, my children, when they learn to read, if you gave them F-A-R-E and said, Josh, what does it mean? Say, well, fair, you know. And he would even sometimes, because he couldn't pronounce thumb, wait a minute, which one was it? Yeah, he couldn't pronounce TH, so he would read it as, no wait, he couldn't pronounce S, so he would pronounce it as th. So if you show him S-O-M or S-U-M, he'd say thumb. Yeah, thumb. Right? He's listening to himself read S-U-M and thumb. Yeah, this is thumb. He doesn't do it anymore. Very quickly, just before we go, this is going to go up now, so you can listen to me. But, yeah, just a second. What are we doing? There's a section in the reading on deep dyslexia, which is very complex. But you need to read that. It will explain to you how to use the diagram to infer what's going on. We don't have time for that. So that's a little bit of homework before Friday. Okay?